Hi everyone. So please mute your mics as we begin the webinar and throughout the presentation. I'll do a brief introduction of myself. My name is Rena and I'm the Multicultural Outreach Worker and Victim Service Worker, a part of the Violence Prevention Program, and my pronouns are she and her. Before we begin, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. I'm joining this presentation from my home, situated on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, and in particular the Coquitlam First Nations, on whose territory I live and work. I'd also like to acknowledge that you probably are all joining us today from many different cities and areas, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. I'd also like to recognize that today marks the last day of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, and to take the opportunity to see how you play a part in ending gender-based violence, especially for populations who may face unique barriers and challenges, such as international students, which is why this presentation is probably a great way to end the 16 days of activism. Like I said, there's screenshots and recordings being taken. So if you do not want your face being shown, please turn off your cameras. And there will be a questions portion at the end of the webinar. So feel free to type in the chat box, and then we will address all of them at the end. And now, without further delay, I'll pass it on to our speakers, Will and Edris.
Thank you so much, Rena, and it's a pleasure to be here with you this morning. My name is Will Tao. I go by pronouns he, him, and I represent the Our News Foundation. I'm here with my executive director, Idris Arib. We are also both colleagues at Edelman and Company Law Offices, so I'm an immigration and refugee lawyer. And Idris, in his section of the presentation, will talk a little bit more about what he does around civil society organizations and his experiences. So without further ado, we're happy to start the presentation on international students and the global pandemic, looking specifically at COVID-19 updates and the role of civil society organizations. And as I know you're all celebrating the 16th and final day of advocacy and activism, I will also add a lot of information on how we can step up for international students in our work. Okay, so I also, I know Raina did an incredible land recognition, but I also want to recognize on my end that we live and work on the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We also really want to recognize the harm created by immigration. I know we often in our work deal with it in a very positive sense, but that immigration is also a process by which land has been migrated and extracted and stolen from indigenous communities through settler colonialism. We also recognize that education specifically has been weaponized as part of that process. So whenever we deal with education, especially when we look at the benefits or the acculturalization, assimilation that education serves as, we have to recognize the harm that it has done historically. And that is why we've shared this image, a very powerful image from the BC Teachers Federation's Hitting History ebook. So today's presentation will occur in 6 parts, and then we'll hopefully get to a conclusion as well as a question and answer. I'm going to begin by giving a lay of the land pre-COVID, introducing international students and postgraduate work permit policy. We'll then talk about how COVID has changed the landscape, and I put changes and confusions. We'll talk about the outstanding gaps where I think and I hope changes can be made into our study permit and postgraduate work permit regime. I'll then give a quick crystal ball of just what I think about the future. And again, I use the words hope and cope as sort of a dual mechanism to look at the future. Finally, 3 immigration takeaways, again, for the advocacy and activism part. What can we do in our roles as settlement workers and in our community, and also, just as community members, when we have international students living with us in our community, how do we help them and advocate for them? And then finally, Idris will really look at the civil society organization. So this is more systemically looking at the broader picture of Mosaic and organizations such as Mosaic, and what civil society organizations can do to help international students during the pandemic and moving forward. We'll leave with a discussion on what our organization is trying to do and our own mission as an independent CSO. I hope we can collaborate with Mosaic more moving forward. We've already started to do so here, and I think there's a bright future with our two organizations. When it comes to international students, we really have to reconcile the realities. I think for many of us, we want to see the image on the left. We want to see the happy, smiling, multicultural arrival of individuals who help brighten Canada, make it more diverse and inclusive. But more often, especially increasingly, we're seeing the opposite picture. We're seeing, and especially in my work as an immigration lawyer, I'm seeing international students come into my office in states of depression, of breaking down, of needing mental health support, but being afraid to reach out, of stress from their families back home. And it's creating these dual challenges, and especially for myself as someone who wants to help them in a positive light, but sees the negativity and the way our system exacerbates some of those challenges. So in terms of the part one, I'm gonna have slides on each of these, so I won't go into too much detail, but I did want to drive where international students stand in our international student regime, both as drivers of the economy, as temporal and exportable, as future permanent residents, how we're shifting as a system towards system integrity and how that's created negative impacts on international students, and then the whole problem of postgraduate work permits, which is sort of the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow of international studies, where a lot of students come to Canada for the hopes of getting that work permit to then transition to permanent residence. So in a bit of a stark image, international students are a huge driver for our Canadian economy. It increases significant benefit to the economy and both in terms of tourism, but also in expenditures and how much it pumps into tuition. And Idris will talk about that further. But there has been an increase in international student applications over the past few years, and there's been a huge increase in the tuition costs for international students, which is a huge issue as well. Sorry for saying three huges in one line, but that's really what the situation is. Between 2014 and 2018, we saw an increase in international students by 68%, and a total in 2018. Again, we're using 2018. There are stats for 2019, but the last couple of years are a bit skewed, especially 2020, of course, this year because of COVID. So we want to sort of trace it to the most recent complete numbers. And 721,205 students, a lot, and you see that almost 50% of them, or more than 50% of them, come from India and China. So we have those large population groups. We probably will see similar stats this year and moving forward, although I would not be surprised if the numbers for China, for various reasons, start decreasing over the next little bit. In 2018, international students in Canada contributed an estimated $21.6 billion to Canada's GDP and supported almost 170,000 jobs. So this is the lens that the policymakers, the government, the Minister of Immigration looks at when it starts prioritizing the return of international students as one of the first things since COVID. And many will, if you've been following the news, there's been a bit of dispute over those who want family reunification and wondering why international students were sort of first in line. That can give a reason. So this graph pretty much shows the number of study permits issued. Do note that not all international students hold study permits. In fact, there are a lot of international students who can study short-term courses without needing to hold study permits. And of course, there's a bunch of international students now who are actually overseas, beginning their courses virtually, pending the second stage approval, who are still international students but don't yet have study permits issued. All this to say, the numbers have increased significantly over the past several years. Another part of the international student regime that often gets under-examined is that international students are still deemed and considered by the system very temporal. It is meant to be a temporal application, and international students are often adjudged or scrutinized for their credibility. Why do they want to come to Canada? How much are the studies a portion of that, or the primary reason versus other things they want to do, for example, economic or jobs or family reunification, which are often viewed under a very critical lens. And there's also a big policy around exportable Canadiana. And I put that because, it gets missed all the time. Part of the international student regime is not with the primary purpose of just getting all the individuals in Canada to guarantee permanent residence. As you see from statistics, in 2018, only 25% of those invited for PR were actually international students. And that number is far lower than the actual number of international students in Canada. There is a big part of our international student regime that's about sending those with Canadian education back to countries where they initially applied from, to then export Canadian values, Canadian education, and build business to help link Canada. And that often gets missed. So I wanted to name that out as a policy reason for international students. So when a study permit applicant applies to Canada, they have to demonstrate temporary intention, or they can, in some rare cases, demonstrate dual intention. But the idea, it has to be a temporary, primarily a temporary application. What that means is they have to demonstrate that they're going to leave Canada at the end of their stay. And when an applicant from a global south country comes with their dependents, spouses or children, it's often an area where they get scrutinized. And especially if their own country is going through instability. And as COVID has revealed, many countries do have unstable systems, and that is becoming more clear and therefore giving rise to more refusals. Students are often also scrutinized for their bona fides. So older students, those who are changing their studies to new areas. Many individuals that I come in contact with who actually contact me are students having a bit of midlife crises or new ideas on what they want to do with their lives. Those kind of things are viewed very critically in Canadian immigration. And although the government is supposed to follow up with students if they have concerns about credibility, they are often refused because the government believes, or the visa officer believes, that the students can attend cheaper programs, similar programs, or that they're making a wrong decision financially or for their career or lives. And that is a reason for refusal. The courts have disagreed with that, but how many international students are going to pay the substantial amount of fees to launch a case in Canada, especially when they're not here? So what we instead see are a bunch of refusals that would likely not stand judicial review, but because no one refused it and no one goes to court, the students keep getting refused for those reasons, and many have to apply 4, 5, 6, 7 times and keep getting refused over and over again. So there is a barrier on entry. And we'll talk about the stats since COVID and how that has increased, the refusals have increased. So yes, this is actually from IRCC, is just an example, but the idea of exportable Canadiana in a visual sense. International students are still, though, the future permanent residents of Canada. And the government did focus, and this is actually from the Conservative government in 2010, moving towards a Canadian experience class from the federal skilled worker. So for some of you who know a bit about permanent residency, federal skilled worker requires an individual to have 1 year of skilled work experience, but most of that will come from outside Canada. And Canadian Experience Class is a program for individuals who are inside Canada and have 1 year skilled experience in the last 3 years. And the requirements for this program are lower and oftentimes easier to meet if they are in Canada. But how do they get to Canada to get that 1 year work experience? For most younger individuals who don't have an employer supporting them, it is through international education. And that's why international education is considered the gateway or the pathway to PR, permanent residence in Canada. And we also saw, for example, Express Entry, which is a system that awards points for immigration for permanent residency through economic immigration, the main system that now sorts candidates. It was amended in 2015, I believe, or was it 16? I can't remember the exact date, but it was amended to award additional points for Canadian education. So it gives individuals more points if they've attended university or college in Canada, and depending on the level of study, gives you more points. So there is a big incentive for international students to come to Canada to study in order to secure their future's permanent residence. Although, as we mentioned, not all of the students, and in fact, a very few percentage of those who have past studies in Canada are actually becoming permanent residents, which means there are a lot of students who are caught by a system either with not enough points or without the requisite employment experience in Canada. you're going to see more and more in your work as settlement, individuals who have come to Canada likely when they were in elementary school or high school. So they could have been in Canada 10, 12, 15 years already, graduating from university and still having challenges getting enough points to immigrate to Canada. And what do we tell these individuals? How do they stay in Canada becomes a huge problem, and it's an increasing one that I'm seeing in my practice. At the same time, the government has made significant shifts towards system integrity. So back in the early, I believe this was about 2010 now, around that area, or through 2012, the government started looking into, they started getting news of international student fraud, schools that were not really operating properly, international students who are trying to get the, fake documentation to try and graduate to then apply for PR. So it created the governments and CBSA especially a huge investigation into how do we make the system better for system integrity. And one of the things they did early on was to phase out private institution pilots. So there was a program that allowed certain private institutions to give postgraduate work permits to students if they were on a list. That list, even though it was unofficially ended, still for many years continued, where students who went to that program got postgraduate work permits. What happened then is the government realized it, some cases were in the media, and then now they've really shut out private institutions. And that's been a big deal because before, many individuals would utilize private institutions because the admission standards were a bit lower, or it was a pay-to-play system, so you could pay tuition and get into these schools to then transition into postgraduate work permit. I don't want to draw it all in a negative light though. There are many very, very good private institutions that are focused on areas such as the arts, media and entertainment, acting, for example, all those areas where traditionally, design, where there are huge economic benefits for Canada, but there are no suitable programs or lack of the specialized programs at public institutions. So there are those issues too. Unfortunately, those students are caught because they're in the wrong program. There's also now been a huge scrutiny of online programs. So before, some schools would offer majority online classes. Again, I'm talking about this in the pre-COVID. COVID has made some exceptions, but pre-COVID, the government started scrutinizing some of these schools that were having mostly online programs and created a 50% rule where more than half the program had to be in person in Canada in order to get the postgraduate work permit. They also scrutinized what's called matriculation agreements. So private institutions would partner with public institutions. The idea being, do 1 year at our private, we'll give you 1 year at the public. We can combine the program lengths. The government has cracked down on that. So now they only count that valid time spent at the public institution. The big change that is very problematic, and this came in 2014, I believe, was the actively pursuing studies requirement. So what this did was essentially require international students to actively pursue studies in Canada in order to maintain their study permit validity. So both on an extension application where their study permit was expiring, or in many cases actually at the border, the US border, many officers actually issued removal orders there. If a student wasn't making active pursuit of their studies, active progress, they would become inadmissible to Canada. So what that has created really is a two-tiered system where international students have to go to class, have to make progress, and where a domestic student has the ability, for example, to take some time off, do some other things, come back, switch institutions. All of that gets extra scrutinized when it's an international student. Furthermore, when applying for postgraduate work permits, you have to maintain full-time status, as I'll talk about in a later slide, which has created another slew of problems where at institutions, many times due to registration issues or academic probation or some challenges, students cannot maintain full-time during their course of their studies. There is an exemption for the final semester, but ultimately, this rule for postgraduate work permits, combined with the actively pursuing studies rule, has put a lot of pressure on international students. You then have leave and deferral rules that have only recently been clarified. And this was actually, I was working with Rena a lot on this, and this is one area of advocacy and activism that I hope Mosaic takes forward. As you know, Mosaic was working on a project regarding sexual assault of international students within the, who had issues, then trying to go on leave and trying to heal from their experiences. One of the big problems is, in order to get a leave, you must get the institution's permission. So you can think of issues and situations where, for instance, if an international student was sexually assaulted on the university campus, or maybe even by someone associated with the university, or then going back to that same university to trying to seek leave so that they don't get reported to immigration, becomes a problem. And I forgot to mention, international education institutions called designated learning institutions have to report students and their attendance in quarter, and I think I'm not sure if it's annually or biannually now, updates to immigration, but they have to let immigration know, is the student in full-time status, are they part-time, or have they no-showed? So that is where a lot of conflicts can be created. And the system is a bit messy, and students have been recorded incorrectly, especially when they've switched between institutions. Finally, there's a huge crackdown on misrepresentation, document fraud, and overseas agencies. And you will see a lot of your clients and international students having come into the immigration system or initially gotten into their schools through international agents abroad. Because what many international agents do in order to help students is they don't actually charge too much money for the actual study permit application, but get paid a huge portion, a finder's fee, so you will, agency fee, for actually placing the student in the school. So the students think it's great, I only have to pay $50, but they actually pay all the money out in tuition down the road. And these agents are often not immigration lawyers or registered, regulated immigration consultants, RCICs. They're oftentimes just agencies abroad. So their initial paperwork is filled with mistakes, filled with misrepresentations, and that all comes back to the students when they eventually are here. They no longer have that support, and now they need to find consultants and lawyers. When we see their paperwork, it's a mess. You know, from failing to disclose previous refusals, which is misrepresentation, to, in some cases, we've seen even fraudulent documents, fraudulent IELTS results, and so forth. Which goes to the final part, criminality. International student criminality is viewed very critically. The law is very low threshold on criminality. So one indictable offense, and it doesn't even have to be indictable, it could be a hybrid offense. Essentially, if it could have been pursued indictably, if there's a conviction that that international student is inadmissible to Canada. So it covers the whole range of things. And even if there's no conviction, CBSA is looking very hard. So CBSA stands for Canada Border Services Agency. They're the investigators. They're the ones who remove individuals from Canada. They also do border security. Even if there is no conviction, oftentimes an international student won't know how to properly fill out the forms, and they'll forget to mention they were ever arrested. They'll think, oh, why do I have to check this off? I wasn't even convicted. Well, the question asks if they've ever been arrested before. And if they say no, or CBSA will often pursue them for misrepresentation. So even though they're not criminally inadmissible to Canada, they're kicked out of Canada as a result. And it does happen that international students are arrested by CBSA, and I'm unfortunately in my time working with students and going to, I don't know if many of you know, but the public library, Library Square, in the 7th floor, there's government offices. Inside the 7th floor is actually an immigration detention center. So, it doesn't necessarily look like a full jail. There's no bars, but for all intents and purposes, a jail, right? Like there's a bathroom, there's like 7 or 8 shared in a room. Of course, during COVID, they're not doing that now, but you'll have 7 or 8 foreign nationals in a room together. They're fed Subway 3 times a day or 2 times a day when they're there. And then essentially they have all their meetings, and all the meetings with the government, and some of them will just break down, right? Because they're sharing cells with actual criminals as well. And to tell a student who didn't go to class why they were in handcuffs and arrested for 3 days is difficult. It's a difficult thing for them to understand. None of them will many of them don't want to call their families because that would be the last thing they want to tell their elderly parents back home, that they're in a Canadian jail for not going to school, right? So it's a very complicated situation, but unfortunately a problem that I've seen. Speaking of problems, postgraduate work permits is the big problem. Eligibility for postgraduate work permits depends on the eligibility of the institution. They have to be a DLI and an eligible postgraduate work permit granting school. And the international student has to attend full-time at that program during the duration of the program. And this creates a huge challenge when students have academic and personal challenges, as I discussed earlier. Officers are scrutinizing their decisions very carefully, even when the school is, for example, supporting students. The students studied full-time. I've had many cases where international students, the school said they were, but then the officers went to their transcript and tried to say, well, it looks like you went on exchange here. It looks like you didn't, why is there this wording on your transcript? Even though the officers are definitely not experts at these transcripts, and then refusing applications. So the discretion has been applied very inconsistently. And one of the problems with postgraduate work permits is they're non-extendable. So the general rule is if it's less than 8 months, you get 8 months. If it's a year, you get a year. If it's more than 2 years, or if it's less than 2 years, you get the duration of your studies. And if it's a 2-year program or more, you get 3 years. But 3 years is the max, and it's not extendable. We're not sure yet what COVID's going to bring in terms of those extensions, but it's a one-time shot. And it's often very hard if you get refused to try and restore yourself back to that permit. So it's a lifeline for international students, right? As I mentioned, if they want to apply for the Canadian Experience class, they need 1 year of Canadian work experience. That's not, the studies doesn't count. All the work during their studies doesn't count for that. If they want that 1 year, they need this postgraduate work permit to get 1 year of skilled experience and then try and be competitive in their points to apply for PR. So how has COVID changed the situation? So we had different phases. I'm going to call them 4 phases. But in the first phase, you had that travel restriction on international students. So they said if you did not hold a visa or approval letter before March 18th, don't come to Canada. And they started to essentially barred international students from returning, unless they had before March 18th, and also they had to show that they were actually coming home and they had a requirement to be back in Canada. Phase 2 was then allowing studies to begin abroad. I think one of the big things that the lobby of the schools to immigration was, listen, we need to start making, if we want to bounce back in our economy and deal with COVID, international students need to be able to start studying in our schools. And Idris will go into the stats and tell you why later. It's pretty stark from the financial perspective and tuition perspective. But what the government did was they did a 2-stage process where you could be approved for the first stage and allowed to begin your studies abroad and still have that count towards postgraduate work permit eligibility, but you needed to wait for second stage approval. So you still have many international students who got the first stage approval abroad, have already started their classes, but have not been approved yet for the second stage to come to Canada. They did amend some of the postgraduate work permit rules to allow for greater flexibility. So even if you began studies outside Canada, you can still get a postgraduate work permit counting some of that time. They also expanded the work definition, allowing international students who are working in essential services to work extra hours, and also gave some exceptions on work hours and so forth, and documentation for complete applications and so forth. Phase 3, which has just started in October, so the old phase was September 15th. That's when they stopped the 2-stage process. Now there's this DLI readiness plan. So if the schools have a plan and they're approved, the international student can come back to Canada if they can demonstrate that they're going to quarantine and they can meet the readiness plan and so forth. And that has started as of October 1st, and then the schools continue to be updated. So we're going to see more international students come in the new year for the January semester. However, simultaneously, the government in phase 4 that I've called, as of November 30th, also announced that they're going to resume Canada Border Services Agency removals and refusals are going up. So essentially, you have a lot of international students that because of COVID during this time, for financial reasons, for many reasons, couldn't continue their studies, didn't maintain status or out of status. Those individuals are going to be slowly but surely removed from Canada. And our system is actually very good. Many of you may have followed the US, and you look at the US, how can they be deporting so many people, removing? Well, the problem is they didn't track people very well. Canada actually has a much better system, and removal is much quicker. If you're an overstay, you can be out of Canada quite quickly. As soon as if you have a valid passport and you've overstayed, you don't need to go to an independent decision maker. It's pretty quick. Within a couple of days, you can be removed. Many times, even the borders officers will tell the students, I can write a report and find you inadmissible for a year, or you can leave tomorrow. And many students facing such a dilemma will leave right away. So all this to say, that is on its way. There are also significant moves towards a Hong Kong strategy. So you will start to see when the government announces it in January or in the new year what those details are. More Hong Kong students come into Canada and better pathways for PR for them as well in light of what is going on. So the key resulting changes during COVID, we had more accommodation for online learning, depending on when the program started and program length, so that they could still get postgraduate work permits. The government is actually, they have on their website a detailed list of, depending on when you study and the length of your program, whether you're able to get a postgraduate work permit, what percentage of your studies need to actually be in person eventually. There's, of course, quarantine plans, and that's the logo for the Arrive Canada plan that the international students have to fill out before they come to Canada. There's a really interesting change, and actually we've been asked by the Canadian Bureau of International Education next year to speak on this because it's so interesting, this immediate family members. We've seen over the time an increase in the number of immediate family members being refused. So if an international student is trying to bring in their spouse or children, they're getting refused. Well, now the government has updated their instructions to say, you must demonstrate an essential purpose if you are an immediate family member to help the applicant or the international student establish and support them. And I actually wrote a piece just 2 days ago on my blog, Vancouver Immigration blog, questioning this, because one of the major reasons why international students are refused is if they show too much establishment in Canada and too many ties to Canada. So if you now have family members in some of these countries saying, you know what, we're going to come to Canada, we'll find a job, we'll help support our international student spouse, the concern on my end is they're going to refuse you because they're going to say you have too many ties to Canada and you have family ties and you're not going to leave Canada at the end of your stay. So it's going to be interesting to see how this requirement is interpreted by decision makers, but it does create a contradiction in my mind. And just from statistics, and recently we've been gathering these, it's very, very fascinating. But just, and for refusals, we only have January to March. So it's probably gonna be worse from March to September. But for the COVID refusals, we had, before COVID in 2019, 40% of study permits were refused. And since COVID, we've had an increase of about 10%, 50% now are refused. And most of the top refusal rate countries are in the global south, Africa, Middle East, Caribbean, Central Asia. So if you want to take an anti-racist lens to this, refusals are certainly coming from certain countries. And just yesterday, and we're going to be writing an our news report on this for H&C refusals. H&Cs are humanitarian compassionate grounds applications. And these are for individuals who really have no other chance to stay in Canada, can't get a temporary resident permit. They want to stay permanently because they've, for example, been in Canada many years, have family here, have children here. We've seen a major shift. And we have almost full year numbers for this. For 2020, we have until September, and 2019 with a full calendar year. But refusal rates approval rates went from 66% last year to now 35% this year. So those who are seeking humanitarian, sort of the safety net PR because they have no other way to obtain it, are getting refused at a much, much higher rate. So if you think of your international student who's been here since they were a kid, who doesn't have a pathway to permanent residence, that can't get a work permit, goes out of status, this is the application for them. And those are the stark numbers about approval and refusal rates. So the reality on the ground for the students, and this is really relevant information to international or to settlement advisors like yourself, settlement services workers, the quality of international student advisors varies greatly from institution to institution. If your student's at a good school, they have a very robust team, 7 to 8 advisors, a website that's up to date, sessions where you can book the international student advisor, work on your case. They help you. Of course, they take the university's lens on it, so sometimes they're going to be protective. You should still tell your clients and your students to get independent legal advice or seek independent advice where possible. But that, at other schools, and I just had a call with a couple of them, major schools, these are schools you'd think are some of the best in Canada. I was just told by one of their staff, they have 2 advisors. They don't have any record keeping. They don't have any documentation on the cases. They have no updates, and they're trying to help students. So this is a problem, especially during COVID, because the government has said when the students apply down the road for things, they need the schools to provide the evidence and documentation about what they were doing, their studies, the breakdown, were they in class, were they not, all those things. And if you don't have the staff to do it, I don't know how what's going to happen for the students. So oftentimes the international students, as I mentioned, are themselves not familiar with immigration paperwork. So many of the younger ones, especially, their parents did it. The agents did it for them. They don't know how to fill out forms. And then there's a lack of safe and brave spaces to organize and advocate. So these schools are taking, as Idris will show you, 4 or 5 times more in tuition, but aren't creating any spaces for advocacy and organization, counseling, those types of vital services. Although COVID in a virtual space has given more space for international students themselves to advocate, so you've started to see some of these major organizations pop up to help international students, which has been great, but it's still in virtual space. So we've heard from students, it's still very isolating during this time. So how do we handle the gaps? Where are the gaps? Well, first of all, is there going to be some sort of postgraduate work permit recapture or COVID amnesty? Because all the international students, many of them were the first to lose their jobs when they held postgraduate work permits. As you can probably imagine from these companies, the easiest people to let go of are those who do not have strong ties to Canada, who don't have permanent resident or citizen or citizens. So international students lost their jobs in a high percentage. I don't know if we'll ever get those stats, but I just know from my own experience of students coming to see me, a lot of them lost their jobs. So what happens if they had a 3-year postgraduate work permit or they had only 1 year left and then they just lost a year because of COVID? And they're probably gonna lose some more because even though the vaccine, it's all pray, is coming in, it's still gonna take a while for COVID to go away or to be addressed, right? So we don't know what the government's gonna do, but again, we already know that they're starting to remove people who are out of status. Are they gonna give some sort of recapture? Who's going to fund the safe, independent social services for international students, right? And that's where I think Mosaic, if you're applying for government funding, if you're applying for grants now, and I know with the project that I was working on, so I was a liaison to this project through the Law Foundation on international students who had sexual assault victims and how to address that both in the Lower Mainland, but also in the rural communities that we've seen an increase in. Who's going to help? Right? Because we can't put it all on institutions, which is what the system has appeared to do. Because institutions at the end of the day, they need their funds, they need their student money. And when it comes down to protecting their own pockets versus the international student, it's a no-brainer, right? From any analytical lens, they're going to look at their own risk management and finances first. So who's helping the international students? And right now, because most international students are not eligible for most social services provided by settlement services, very few people are looking out for them. So that's where there needs to be someone and some organizations, and we hope our news does it as well, and we hope that Mosaic does it as well, steps in for international students' mental health and well-being. I hope the government leverages technology. Right now, it's not a very transparent system. Right? The schools report directly to immigration whether the students have been attending or not. Most students have no clue what that report is, and it creates problems. Most students don't even have access to their own immigration documents because if their agent did it or some consultant or lawyer did it, it's in their portal. So the students can't see it, they can't update it. So how do we create a virtual transparent system where students who are now very tech savvy can actually update immigration? if something goes wrong, tell immigration, and not have it have a huge negative effect because of a lack of information. How do we eliminate unauthorized agents and regulate education consultants? Many of you will be surprised to hear that international tuition, up to 25 to 30% of first-year tuition, and actually in subsequent years as well, doesn't actually go to the school. It goes to an education consultant. It goes to an agent for the school. So when a school charges 4 or 5 times more, and then 30% of it isn't even being realized by the school or by the immigration system, could very much be flowing to some consultancy in Beijing or in Delhi, that's a problem. And yet there's no regulation of this whatsoever in BC. It's provincial jurisdiction. Manitoba, I believe, has tried, but we haven't seen any updates in cases or any sort of, we don't know how that's working out, to be honest. And then I'm going to leave this to Idris, but caps and controls on international tuition, I think, is a must, because some of the fees they pay are ridiculous. Of course, comparative to other countries, and I see it on this slide, they may be paying less than in the US or Australia and other countries, but still, it's a significant amount that's created a lot of issues from a mental health perspective and a physical wellness perspective. So my crystal ball, what does the future look like? I think it's a mixed picture of hoping and coping. I do believe there's going to be a backlog with temporary resident permit holders and H&Cs. We're already seeing an increase in numbers on both. What happens to individuals international students who no longer meet the requirements to study in Canada, or who graduate and can't find jobs and can't get permanent residence? What happens to them? What happens to their rights? And then how does Canada capture its competitive advantage? Because, if we take that economic lens, we still have a much more facilitative program than in the US and Australia. We let students work 20 hours a week during their studies. In most countries, their student studies permits don't let that. We give them very robust postgraduate work permits. We have that 3-year. In the US, for example, it's a 1-year permit unless they're in STEM and it's renewable. So we do offer comparatively better immigration pathways to international students. But just because of that, we need to actually do more to protect international student rights, because it opens students up to be exploited more by institutions, by employers. And that's a very important thing we have to keep in mind. And what are the unintended consequences? Inability to continue studies, students are switching institutions, students are going through mental health challenges, they're being exploited by employers, they're getting poor advice by unscrupulous representatives from agents. They're often hiding the severity of situation from families overseas, and this is very important for settlement workers as well, because international students, many times, families have leveraged their entire life savings to help the students study. In some countries, they've given up land, they have loans, just to help the students study. So for them to call back home and say, I've run into trouble, I need more money, I need to pay a lawyer, I need to get out, I need to do something, they can't face their families with that information. So they, I've seen one case where a student actually decided to go to a third country, leave Canada and go to a third country and keep their parents in the dark. The parents still think they're in Canada. That's how severe it's gone for international students. Unfortunately, you're also seeing an uptake in crime, and we don't want to stereotype, and I said here, but you are seeing international students. I've seen a lot more financial crime stuff in the last little bit. Of course, domestic violence, sexual assaults, those things are on the increase as well. You're also seeing relationships of inconvenience. You're seeing international students in a rush, in a panic, listen to some advisors or find someone quickly and get into relationships, and that's causing problems on the family law side, on these relationships, on broken down families down the road, on marriage fraud. So that is happening. And then you're seeing PR challenges, where many international students aren't able to apply for PR or getting refused. So the pandemic itself has hurt international students. I shared an article from the Daily Hive, and it talked about the really sad death of Amrinder Sandhu. But an international student can't afford $150 per hour for counseling. And that's I want to say one thing. This is a big misnomer. This idea that international students, because their tuition fees are so high, are loaded, are wealthy, are cash cows, and then others around that system, advisors, bankers, schools, social services people, they all start taking advantage of that. You must have money. Well, no. Many international students, like I said, the families pretty much gave up an arm and a leg for them to come to study here. Many of them are still borrowing money from friends and family or contacts here. So $150 per hour for counseling is expensive, and many students, also due to the cultural stereotypes and stigmas against mental health, aren't getting the right advice they're needing. So an example, again, is Amrinder Sidhu, at 21 years old, took his life in the middle of COVID due to depression, and was having a lot of difficulty after trying to study here and without the support system and all the challenges and stigmas that faced. All right, close to the end. I've been sort of talking nonstop here, but 3 takeaways, and I love this takeaway pictures that I found, but the takeaways. 1, make the appropriate referrals at the right time. I think some of us want to be superheroes and solve all the problems of some of our clients. When it comes to immigration, when it comes to international students, flag and know when something's wrong, but don't try and solve everything yourself. Make sure they get the appropriate referrals. And there are people who, there's, for example, there are legal clinics that do things for low costs. There are different things that are accessible to international students. Try and refer those if needed. Refer it to the mental health experts where needed. Make those referrals. Number 2, uncertainty is part of the process. Immigration, for one reason or another, because of the reputations gone overseas, many individuals think, it's always about, am I going to be successful? Am I going to get this? Am I going to be PR? Can I get this? They need that percentage chance, but the reality, it's an ocean of uncertainty right now. And as advisors, you cannot, the worst thing you can do, and I do this in my own practice too, I cannot tell a client if they're going to be successful. I cannot give them false expectations. I cannot set the bar so incredibly high. I have to just tell them the process and say that I know it and I'm going to walk you through it. But too much of what international students get tricked by and cheated by is that promise, that empty promise or that fraudulent promise. And number 3, recognize the complexity. We need to not oversimplify the narratives. We need to not oversimplify narratives of international students as being loaded, as being rich, as them being, reusable, even though the governments may even use some of those, temporal, as I mentioned, that those stigmas. We need to mention that there's also a whole slew of problems that have arisen, and they may have wrongdoing, and that is also something we have to accept as well and address. So we should not oversimplify our narratives. All right, my throat is parched. I hope that was useful. It was almost an hour actually, but Idris will finish off our session and talk about civil society organizations, and I will help him move the slides. But this is really where you can start thinking about Mosaic's bigger picture and the role of our work. So Idris, I'll pass it on to you.
Yeah, thank you, Will. Good morning, everyone. I also want to thank again Rana and Parminder for facilitating this session and making this session possible. So as a start point, and to have a general overview of where we stand as a civil society organization and activists, I want us to take a moment and look at the pillars of fair trial and envisage a fair, just, and democratic society. So for a fair trial, there are 3 pillars, like undisputed principles necessary. First, like having an independent and impartial judge, and then we have the crown or prosecutor and the police, and then the 3rd pillar should be the legal representation, defense lawyers, and legal counsels. So that's the principles. So now we want to envisage a fair and just and democratic society. The same way, to have a just and fair and democratic society, we should focus and have 3 principles: operational and functional. The first one would be the government. Of course, the pillar of government is the 3 branches of the government, like legislative, judiciary, and executive. Of course, thanks to Montesquieu. So these 3 pillars will always be there. The second pillar of the society is the business sector and the media. So the 3rd important pillar of a society is the independent civil society organizations. what's the role of independent civil society organizations as a main pillar of the society? That's what we're going to cover now. So people say that, of course, when we talk about the government pillar, the business and the media pillar, when it comes to international students, it's the public educational institutions and private educational institutions. And then they have to deal with immigration, with CBSA, which well mentioned. And then we have the international students, which they need support, right? And that's why it comes the important role of civil society organizations to support international students. So the first role of civil society organization, which they should do and they should support, is as watchdogs. As watchdogs, the civil society organization perform their main role by exposing and identifying prone areas and criticizing the gaps and injustices in the system and institutions. However, as per and my research, the civil society organizations in BC have not been able to perform this task when it comes to international students as it should be. Well mentioned some of the problems, and I would like to focus on just one of those, which is the high cost of the tuition by institutions and not putting back into adequate services for international students. So according to Stat Canada, the tuition fee difference between domestic students and international students is like 3 times higher for international students than the domestic students. But more interestingly is the raise of the tuition fee for international students in comparison to domestic students. So we did assess the percentage, the change in raise of this fee per year for both the domestic students and international students. We can easily see that within the last 4 years, the domestic students' tuition fee have been raised 3% to 7% max. But for international students, the increase has been from 35% and 24% increase in the tuition fee. So as an activist, as a civil society organization, we should be able to ask the educational institutions for clarification that why is this so, right? If you just want to take advantage of international students and not providing the proper services, so we should be able to criticize and demand for accountability. And also, like interestingly, as you can see, 2019 and 2020 here, there has been a decrease on tuition fee for the domestic students, like 5% almost. But not only the tuition fee for international student decreased, but they increased it to 8.1%, like 1%. So that's like something, it shows the unjust and unfair treatment of international students by educational institutions, of course. So the next role of the civil society organization, if we go back, is raising public awareness and civil participation. So we know that CSOs raise awareness and in regards to the problems, but also they have to they have to publish reports and study results for better awareness of the issue. Because if we just like raise awareness and we don't prove that, then it doesn't lead to anywhere. That's why it's important for civil society organizations to operate as networks for preparing a sufficient human resources, and also to encourage civil participation, because civil participation makes the decision making process transparent, and also it enhances the process and it makes it more fair. So we know that the problems that we as a civil society organization raise awareness on are more than like tens and hundreds, if we list them, when it comes to international students. Well pointed out some of them. For example, he pointed out about the suicide among international students, social isolation, mental health, work exploitation, microaggression, explicit racism, and implicit biases. And also sometimes the housing problem is blamed on international students. There are so many problems which they face, which needs awareness raising and encouraging civil participation to address this issue. To raise awareness, as we know, doesn't help alone. That's why the civil society organization should be able to propose alternatives, to propose solutions, to propose recommendations for better management of the social justice problem. And also, in this case, we have to, as a civil society organization and experts, we have to be able to propose alternatives for different institutions involving international students for better management of the problem. And I both of us, we are very fan and of three initiatives and projects of Mosaic, is being like the Peer Cafes initiative, the Settlement Support Program for International Students, and Violent Prevention Program. These are something really great projects and great programs, but we really hope that other civil society organizations also step in and address and help together to tackle this problem of international students. The fourth role which civil society organizations play as monitoring and evaluation bodies. As we know that the public institutions, private institutions, they have their annual reports, they have their own assessments and evaluation, but we always need an outsiders monitoring of the situation, because if it's just like your own report, this is just an additional paperwork, which people will not pick it up and it's not even talked about. That's why the civil society organization role is important here to evaluate and monitor those policies, initiatives, plans, strategies, legislations when it comes to social justice problems. And in this case, when it comes to international students, we should be able to monitor and evaluate all the action plans taken towards international students. The fifth one would be accelerator of initiatives. If there's an initiative by any of those two pillars, for example, whether it's like the government, the business sector, the CSOs should be able to participate and the implementation and drafting process of that policy or legislation. But unfortunately, we can see that CSOs are not meaningfully included in the processes. And we have to demand for that. We have to ask for meaningful participation of CSOs to accelerate those initiatives. You cannot wait for ages. The problem that now we fear also, like, if we don't criticize, we don't participate and publish reports, it could be that even post-COVID, they increase the tuition fee even higher, right? And also when it comes to access to healthcare, access to employment for international students, these are the policies which we have to tackle, which we have to address and assess. So I just want to be very brief because we're running out of time. That's why I'm moving quickly in each part. So building coalition. So we all know that there's no one size fits all policy for any social problem, whether it's social, economical, or a political problem. That's why it's also important for civil society organizations to come together, to work together as a coalition. It's not like a business sector that you're not competing about. It's a social justice thing. The beauty of the civil society organization is that when it comes to international students, the more civil society organizations tackle in this issue is the better. So that's why we hope that there are other civil society organizations, as Mosaic is doing, they should also take some initiatives. And we also have some, which also leads us to our next part, which is about ORNUS and how we come up with ORNUS and what we are planning to do and what our mandate is. So as ORNUS Foundation, both Will and I, we did our internal research for almost 2 years. We met and we discussed with representatives of the other civil society organizations in BC, representatives of the international students and the educational institutions, as well as the politicians and public officials to discuss the issues and of the international students. And that lead us also, for me, I've worked for around 8 years with different multiple civil society organizations. So that's why we started to build and establish ORNUS Foundation. In ORNUS Foundation, we are focused on promoting and supporting the rights and integration of the newcomers, particularly international students, temporary foreign workers, and refugees in BC and in Canada. So our mandate and our work includes 3 areas: is advocacy, research, and education. And well, feel free to step in if there's anything you want to add. So for advocacy, we want to advocate for underrepresented newcomers and international students. We want to create safe spaces and brave spaces for these communities and international students. And we want to promote the rights and be their voice and create different platforms when it comes to the advocacy parts of our work. And the research aspects, our aim is to reveal issues that are often hidden in plain sight, but are impacting racialized newcomers, particularly international students. So our hope is to publish reports as well, say that we are just working on 2 pieces of research pieces at the moment, and we are hopeful that to publish them like in the near future, which is accessible and concerning the rights of the newcomers, international students, and also temporary foreign workers. And in our education mandate includes to build capacity and empower our target groups. In BC particularly, we want to conduct capacity building training programs, workshops, and we have our news forums planned in the future. And also, yeah, like we really would like to talk in details with, of course, with our colleagues at Mosaic, and to share our projects that we are working on, to seek also your thoughts around that. So that's like how we envisage ourselves in this area, and how we want to proceed in helping the people that we care most about, which are, of course, international students, temporary foreign workers, and refugees in BC.
Thank you so much, Idris. I thought that was a really good summary. And again, this is all part of our education process, right? Where I think in my work as an immigration lawyer, and Idris and I are working with so many international students over the last, especially, it's been the last 2 years that we've worked together, but definitely since COVID, we've also seen an uptake in international students. So to look at their issues, reflect on them, and then try and share it and change policy. We've been grateful to be a part of a bunch of IRCC government consultations. I did 3 of them in the last little bit. So if there's any ideas you have as well, any ideas for change, things that your clients are going through, things that are problems in the systems, gaps in the systems, we often think that it takes a lot of work to try and change some of these things, and it does, but our access level and our proximity to change is much closer than many of us think or imagine. So I'm happy to work with all of you to make some changes. We want to open up to questions and answers. I know we went a little bit over time, but we have about 20 minutes, and we're happy to